Regeneration Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Planning for this meeting. Please may I remind you to turn off your devices. Actually, that's a very good reminder because I've just done it myself because I've forgotten to turn off your devices or put them in silent mode. On the agenda today is a discussion with community groups on community involvement in mayoral planning applications. However, we do have some short items of business first, so I would ask if you could bear with us. Can I now ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received for today's meeting.
Thank you. On declarations of interest, can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interest in any specific items listed on the agenda?
No, Chair.
They're being done. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting held on the 22nd of September 2021?
Confirmed.
Confirmed, thank you. Can we note the completed and outstanding and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence received? Noted, thank you. Right, that brings us to our main item of business. The first of two sessions at how effective community engagement is during the mayoral call-in process. And in saying that, I just want to remind people that's precisely our focus. And I do understand how everyone that is from particular campaign groups, but our sole focus is about the call-in process rather than the application or applications you're particularly concerned about. So sorry about that emphasis, but if we don't do it, it starts to become illegal, and I'd rather we didn't do that. So this is our first opportunity to hear from community organisations and advocacy groups about their experiences of the mayoral call-in process and their perspectives on how the process could be improved. So if I may now welcome all of our guests, I shall I intro you? Yeah, I will, if I can introduce you. We have from Save Noor, Hiba Ahmed. We have Michael Bach from the London Forum of Amenity and Civic Societies. We have Mark Brearley from Vital OKR. We have Tim Catchpole from the Mortlake Brewery Community Group. We have Claire Delmar from Listen to Locals, Jerry Flynn from the 35% campaign, Jacob Gebrekristos from Estate Watch. We have Richard Lee from Just Space, Jonathan Moberly from the East End Preservation Society. We have Conor McNeil from the Victorian Society, Heloise Palin from the Spitalfields Trust, Saif Osmani from the Truman Brewery campaign, or not here yet, but presumably will be here at some point, Angus Robertson from Alton Action, Natalia Perez from the who's the program and co-director for Latin Elephant, and Patria Roman Velazquez, chair of the trustees of the Latin Elephant. Now, to be sure we can hear from all your views, can I ask that you do a very, very brief introduction to your group when you first answer a question, if you can. So, here we go. Right, the main business. I'm going to launch with my first question on behalf of the committee. Other members will come in as well at some point. And my first question is to Michael Bach, actually. I beg your pardon? Oh, of course. That's the very thing you were reminding me of, and I completely forgot. We need to do a very brief statement, first of all, from Hiba Ahmed from Save Noor. And there you go. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair. And thank you to the Planning and Regeneration Committee and the London Assembly for extending this invitation to Save Noor. I'm going to be reading a statement that we co-wrote as a group. And as I said, my name is Hiba Ahmed. I organise in Fight the Tower / Save Noor. We're a group of neighbours and friends based in Brixton. We first came together early 2020 to oppose the eviction of traders in Brixton Market during the pandemic by the market owners and developers of the Brixton Market Hondo Enterprise. And in August 2020, our group formally formed a campaign called Fight the Tower to fight the same developers' plans to build a 20-storey office block at the heart of Brixton. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with our campaign, the tower development, which we're currently opposing, has been called in by Mayor Sadiq Khan. We still don't have a date yet for our hearing, and we've been organising on it basically non-stop since March 2021 this year, when we were told of the Mayor's decision to call it in. So the statement that I'm reading just kind of details broadly our group's experience of going through this process, and I'll be raising things which we've encountered in this space and tell our experience of it. And overall, I just want to stop by saying that the process is a really important one, and we believe that it can be really crucial space for communities to have a say in developments being planned in their neighborhoods, just like we have been doing. However, it doesn't come without its barriers and difficulties, and we've identified them mainly in 3 different areas. The first being the lack of public understanding and readily available and accessible information on call-ins. The second being a perceived lack of democracy and transparency on the process overall. And the third being the lack of user-friendliness, I guess, of the resources that are available on these processes online. So the first issue that we'd like to raise today is on the lack of available and accessible information on the call-in principles and the general transparency around how it works. Because we've found that the 3 call-in principles and grounds of the Mayor of London orders are not made explicit to groups like ours. So community groups are basically not informed about how to effectively lobby the mayor to call in on these grounds. And this is very detrimental to our organizing abilities, because we, unlike the organizations and developers that we take on, don't have hired expertise, and we don't have unlimited resources to access that kind of information. So the call is on us to always be very proactive and try and find that with very, very limited resources. This lack of information doesn't only extend to general community groups that are just in this space. It also involves groups who are part of the objection process in their local councils. So, for example, in our case, we were not informed who our GLA case officer was during the stage 2 and stage 3 of the processes that we were going through, and we couldn't really access them for basic information and communication. We were also not informed when our council sent in information at the end of stage 2, which made it really difficult for us to know where we were in the process. So it was just a race against time and information in a lot of ways. In fact, it seems like community groups or individuals who speak on or against applications publicly, be it at PAC meetings or otherwise, are broadly not informed about or properly brought into these processes and the legal processes of the call-ins. And this is deeply worrying, as we, like I said before, don't have the resources. We're already fighting on uneven grounds to have our voices heard, and the lack of political know-how and the networks that our development counterparts have. And we also don't have the technical expertise that they possess. So this is a really, really big barrier that we have to figure our way around. And yeah, it's a bit of a shame, because we think this is a really important venue which can really kind of amplify community voices and development processes. My second point kind of follows on to that, and it's just about the perceived lack of democratic process. So, for example, when the mayor and the GLA call in decisions, they effectively act and substitute to the local authorities. But however, there is no consultation with local communities around these processes. for example, in the way that the London Assembly is obliged to do. So we think that maybe bringing in something like that could really help improve the process from a democratic point of view. Furthermore, like, it bears repeating that there's a strong sense of exclusion and lack of democratic process around development processes as a whole. This is something that we speak about quite a lot with our community members when we do our canvassing. So we do them every Saturday, pretty much. Go out and talk to community members. But also when we've spoken to people on the legal side of things, like when we've sought counsel, and also when we've spoken with professionals in the development sector, be it in councils or suppliers, they all kind of have a shared understanding of decisions being made more or less before proper consultation with community groups and local communities take place. So one way of shifting that narrative, we think, and getting people more involved in an organized, scheduled way is to kind of improve relations and shared understandings by bringing people in earlier and really taking like a proactive approach to communication, I guess. And also making these really technical areas more accessible and creating a sense of shared cooperation and shared, I guess, how do I explain it? Like, yeah, just a shared sense of development of the areas that we all live in. And also this lack of transparency is then further entrenched by a general lack of understanding, I guess, around the process. So, for example, a lot of information about the call-ins is not made publicly available, which puts groups at a disadvantage when they try to take part in them. So, for example, a lot of information about, who to go to and the technicalities around the process, we had to glean from FOI requests, which take a really long time to make, and it's a bit of a barrier in a way. Also, there are obvious questions about like political considerations behind these call-ins. And politics obviously underpins all development planning and decision making. But as we previously mentioned, because of this lack of information and because of these barriers on how these processes work in the wider public, it would be really, really prudent to make them clearer and to kind of make the scrutiny behind them clearer as well, so that community groups feel like they are going in as equals and not, falling behind. Finally, the final issue that we would like to raise as Save Noor is on the lack of accessibility and user-friendliness of the GLA website. So we found it extremely hard to navigate and find the right information, particularly on where planning applications are. And at times, this website has been completely inaccessible for our less tech-savvy members. Another worrying aspect that finally I'd like to raise has been on the lack of transparency around comments received on applications on the website. So like when you go to the website and you try to submit, it always comes up with no comments have been received, even though they have been submitted. So there's clearly some maintenance issues there. And also there is no opportunity to attach documents, which can make it really difficult to kind of substantiate the comments that you're putting in. So I've now kind of raised some of the barriers that we've encountered as our experience of going through this process. And we'd really like to, once again, just stress the utmost importance of wider public awareness on these processes, which is really, really crucial for us being able to kind of take part in these processes and have our voices heard. And thank you very, very much for having us today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone on what your experiences have been on this application process. So yeah, thank you a lot.
Thank you very much. Can I just do one of those public health warnings? The recommendation for this meeting is that people wear masks when not speaking. That is a recommendation, and for those, obviously that doesn't apply to those who are exempt. So thank you for that. Let's go to now back to the first effective question. We know that local authorities have a statutory obligation to consult the Mayor on any planning applications that are of potential strategic importance in London. And the Mayor assesses whether the application complies with the London Plan policies. At stage 2 of this process, the Mayor can decide to allow the local planning authority decision to stand, to direct refusal, or take over the application, thus becoming the local planning authority. Where the mayor becomes the local planning authority, this is called a stage 3 or call-in. The question I have now to Michael Bach to start off with is, what do you think about this process? Do you think the communities are able to influence applications and through this process?
Okay, my name is Michael Bach.
Ask off you.
I'm a chair of the Planning, Environment and Transport Committee of the London Forum, and I'm here in that capacity. But my experience is actually through having dealt with 3 cases, 2 of which had 2 hearings. So that was the Newcomb House in Notting Hill Gate and Kensington Forum Hotel, and one was a directive refusal where it was on the same side as the mayor at the appeal. The score so far is 2-1 and 1 lost as far as we're concerned. But it wasn't with the benefit of the mayor's assistance, except the last case where he called it in. I mean, I think at the previous meeting we had, we expressed the view that the schemes come to the mayor because of usually the local authority has refused it, and it may be due to their size, tall buildings, insufficient affordable housing, but the mayor has decided to intervene. And the thing that comes out of the analysis, and I'll do it in a little more detail later, is that they've been called in order to be allowed. And therefore, it would appear that the outcome is predetermined. I think the public perception is that there's a chance of getting a refusal. But is there any basis for this? I mean, they look at things like Secretary of State call-in, where it's going in front of an independent planning inspector, and some are allowed and some are dismissed. The mayoral call-in, however, most community groups, even though they may know the recommendation in advance, they probably think they can convince the mayor and the deputy mayor to leave the decision to the borough, in other words, to refuse consent. Do they have any basis for this optimism? The track records of both mayors is that 100% of the recommendations from the planning decisions unit is to allow the application. And that's especially if they've worked very closely with the applicant to deliver more affordable housing, for example, and despite the scheme becoming larger. The track records of both mayors in the last 13 years is that close to 100% of applications are allowed. There are 2 exceptions I can point to you. One is the very strong political lobbying that took place on Charlton Riverside, where all the locals from the Assembly member, council, MP, community were all against it. And I think you could say the mayor was sandbagged. The other one, it comes as a result of policy change. That is, we're in a period of transition during which call-in was decided before the adoption of the London Plan, and the hearing is now after the adoption. And a very good example of this is Mortlake Brewery, where and others will speak about this, but where the mayor recognised that actually, despite the officer's report, he recognised that it really was tall buildings as a matter for the boroughs. So, despite the policy having been in, this is the D9 tall buildings policy, being in the December 17 draft London Plan, the decisions unit continued to use the 2016 plan right up to and including the adoption date of the new plan. So the transition would appear to explain the reason for the decision on Mortlake Brewery, which was contrary to the officer's advice. I'll just make a few comments. I agree with everything you've said, and so I'm not going to repeat that. I'll say some good things about the process. We found that GLA officers were prepared to meet objectors and even do a walkabout. But it was our initiative. In other words, it only happens if there's pressure from the local community to do it. The oral hearing, I think we were given lots of time to present. At that time it was 30 minutes for the objections, and nobody could object to that because most London boroughs are not that generous. I think at 15 minutes there could be some pressure, and we certainly found pressure in the last of the ones on Kensington Forum Hotel, where the stopwatch was in the hands of the officer, who literally stopped you dead mid-sentence. So it wasn't like, you've got 1 minute, can you wind up? And the new protocol is 15 minutes, as I said. I think the perception is that the GLA is remote, arm's length, inscrutable and unapproachable. And when you compare that with what was said in A City for All Londoners, which was the document before the London Plan, the Mayor was concerned that communities should feel comfortable with the new scale of development. It strikes us as that the Mayor has become insensitive to how those developments affect local communities. And I'd like to think that what happened at Mortlake is a change in direction. The real worry, I think, is the policy test for call-in. We're not convinced that many of the cases actually warranted call-in, such as their impact on the London Plan. But challenging the Mayor on this is difficult. It's hard to prove that no reasonable decision maker would have made the decision, and there'd be a high risk of failure in trying to, and the community groups couldn't do it anyway. So I think there's a need to review the interpretation of why things were called in. In other words, do a review of what happened and then try and look objectively at whether that fits it. We found that the committee reports, the stage 3 report and then the committee reports were rather pushing their case where it probably wasn't very strong. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Would anybody like to come in specifically on the ability of the communities to influence applications? If anybody's got experience of going through that process and what your experience was of trying to make your view known. Mr. Flynn.
Well, yes, I just endorse what was said. I think the first problem is most people would not be aware that they could do so. I think the general public is largely unaware of the referral process, full stop, as it is of most of the mechanics of planning. And you only find out about it through painful experience after the event. So I think that's the first hurdle to be overcome.
Assembly Member Sheikh, you wanted to come in.
Thank you very much, Chair. And firstly, I just want to echo Assembly Member Boff's comments about thanking you all for your time. I've had a chance to chat to some of you individually before the meeting started, but just wanted to reiterate to you all now that you're sitting down. We're very grateful for your expertise and your time, and it's fantastic that you've come here, because I agree with what Hibba said. I think the GLA can be a really powerful and effective platform for uplifting community voices, and that is what this committee aspires to do in terms of drawing on your experience and your expertise of planning across the city, and hopefully together working to create a process that's as accessible as possible for community groups to feel like these institutions work for them, because that is the aspiration, and if that isn't happening, then we need to make sure it does, and if it is happening, we need to make sure we solidify those mechanisms that are effective. So a warm welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. I am a London-wide Assembly member, and therefore, it's really fantastic to be able to hear, especially from the kind of localised groups, to be able to tease out the themes, as well as the kind of people who have that kind of broader overview across London. And I think, Michael, that was perhaps a little bit to what you were speaking to, and it's nice to see you again. I know we've met before, and not to preempt something that maybe Richard might come in on, because I have been speaking to Just Space about this, but you mentioned the policy test for call-in perhaps being something that needs to be reviewed. And this is something that I'm quite keen we can develop in this session and maybe afterwards, whether a kind of, if it's all right, a slightly deeper dive from your perspective of what is it about the policy or criteria of call-in right now as it exists that is effective and isn't effective, and looking or beginning to tease out what changes we might make to how we assess whether applications should be called in or not, is something that I'm hoping we can develop. So if it's appropriate in this moment, Chair, that would be something I would hope to tease out.
Sorry, could you...
It's a question directed at Michael about the policy criteria for call-in that he mentioned.
Sure.
We can park it as a question if there's confusion about whether we want to
So
take
rather
it
than
now.
whisper, we do want to focus on the process, and obviously the criteria were a matter of law. Obviously, the interpretation might be interesting to ask about, maybe.
Well, yeah, that's precisely my question.
I think that's in order. I think.
Yeah.
I agree, it's not about the process. I think it's an issue that should be looked at. The criteria are very generously interpreted to allow call-in. I don't need to say any more then.
Okay, let's. Can we go to Ms. Delmar, please?
Yeah, I'd like to just comment on the word that was used in the question, which was the word perceptions. And because I actually believe that perceptions guide all behavior and ultimately in process. And I'll just speak very specifically from the area that I come from, which is Mortlake, and Michael referred to the Mortlake Brewery application process, and that's what I'm going to comment on specifically. And again, it comes back to perceptions. So I think that there was and is a perception that the GLA is a black box. And even worse, I think that it's a perceived, again to use that word, as a black box that's stacked against them. And I like to think that can be changed, and hopefully I'll get a chance to speak later about ways I think that can be changed. But I just want to give one example about why that perception would have been reinforced and would continue to pursue. And that has to do with the transparency of engagement between planning officers at the GLA and the local community. And I highlight that specifically the local community and not the applicant itself. So in our specific case at Mortlake, we had to resort to FOI requests, which puts people on the defensive and is a very different behavior than simply having a process to interrogate. So a series of FOI requests revealed that the planning officers had met with the applicant 23 times from the original call-in, which was May 2020, until the time of the FOI request, which was October 2020. So 23 meetings had taken place with the applicant, only revealed by FOI, and no meetings had taken place between the planning officer team and the local community group, despite requests for said meetings. So I just want to highlight that as something that, a lot of people raised many eyebrows and dropped many jaws with the revelation of that fact. And I think it undermined perceptions even further.
Ms. Roman Velasquez, you wish to come in?
I'm the sort of chair of trustees of Latin Elephant, and our experiences with the Elephant and Castle Town Centre application. I think one of the things I want to sort of highlight was the mayor's intervention in these referred applications, in particular in stage 2, can be positive, and our experience with the planning officers prior to the mayor's sort of decision, together with the evidence that we presented to those officers in pre-meetings, in particular a report that we wrote called the Socioeconomic Value at the Elephant and Castle, led to a one sort of last-minute concession that extended the 5-year sort of affordable retail rent for traders at the Elephant and Castle development to an additional 10 years. And we really applauded that, and we really celebrated that, because our whole argument was about the need for affordable space and why this is needed. However, that concession came because we teamed with researchers from universities who knew how to make this argument. And we drew together other local groups and expertise to do that. That expertise is not always, and those resources is not always at the hand of local groups. So more needs to be done to be able to sort of break that barrier of how do we gather evidence in sort of local groups to convince an understanding of the planning process. And also what we feel is that a more timely intervention at that referral stage would have been more efficient for all of us. When the application was referred to the mayor, we thought the negotiations were still incomplete. There was a lot of things that we really wanted to guarantee for the traders that were still unfinished, and we thought this is our opportunity to influence more the process. However, the mayor made the decision at the time, gave us that additional last minute concession, which was one of the things that we were after. So our recommendation is really for an early intervention that takes into account all these sort of different circumstances of traders, in this particular instance, of the circumstances in a way on the ground, and also for what happens after this process, for monitoring that these are incorporated in the Section 106, that groups are aware that this is happening. It seems like the process then seems to go a bit unmanaged in certain ways, or unmonitored was our experience. And there's another point that we also want to highlight here that is related to this in terms of our experience. It seems like an obvious point to make, but public policy should come first and foremost when approving planning applications. And we want that there is a clear message to all those who are submitting planning applications that they will not proceed if they not fulfill the basic requirements that are stipulated in local, regional, national planning policies. And the perception really is that a lot of planning applications are coming through without fulfilling the basic planning policy documents. And this empowers local groups. So in considering planning applications, the legal requirements are given weight, right, when making these decisions. However, and this is perfectly so, but it seems to contradict the practice. When considering that Latin Elephant and other local groups in Elephant and Castle spent 3 years negotiating over the town centre planning application just to make the application policy compliant. If this would have been policy compliant for the minute, there would have been a lot less time wasted for us, for all stakeholders, for the developers, for the planning officers and councillors as well. So as minimum message and legal requirement, everyone should be demanding from those who are submitting planning applications to make them policy compliant from the beginning. There is no way of going around this, and I think this will benefit ultimately our communities and the public function, right, and the public duty that the government sort of have to do otherwise, and to give a message that you can get away with not being policy compliant sends the wrong message to our communities and to our people and the people that the government should be serving. And with that, I think I'll leave it.
Thank you very much. You've talked about the being policy compliant. Have you got some ideas about making that, how you would make that happen? Because we know that planning applications end up getting approved that aren't policy compliant because of the nature of the dynamics that take place during the planning application approval process.
Well, there is no bending of the rules, basically. There is no way of bending the rules. There is no flexing of the rules. The rules are there to protect the public. It's for the public benefit. So don't bend the rules. Don't make concessions that are not for the benefit, ultimately for the benefit of communities. And I think this is where the message goes wrong. If you are able to submit viability assessments, and if you're able to submit so and so, which all these things, over time change and can be sort of manipulated, if you want to say so, the different data and resources that the communities don't really have sometimes, don't understand what this is. So if the government is working for the communities, then let's just make them policy compliant from the beginning. In multi-billion pounds that we're receiving, less than £1 million in compensation, it seems like, to me, unbelievable. How can they bend rules and get away with these things? So if the policy is there to be implemented.
Raised about the difficulty of engaging with the mayor on planning applications. Perhaps other people could come in about the difficulties or the barriers that exist to engaging with the mayor. Has anybody got any? Yes, Mr. Robertson.
Yes, thank you. So I'm from Alton Action, which is a campaign for better housing and social outcomes for the residents of the Alton Estate in Roehampton. So it's a very practical example backing up some of the points already made. So we were interested in Wandsworth Council's application, which we became aware went to stage 2 with the GLA team earlier this year, but really found the lack of transparency about information, no information in the public arena, and the statement on the GLA website says the mayor will consider and decide within 14 days, but as far as we can find out, these discussions have been going on for the whole of this year for stage 2. So found out who the case officer was and wrote to them in June asking to have a meeting to talk about our activities, which have involved developing a community plan led by residents. And so that was in June. I've had no reply. So then I wrote to our assembly member to ask for assistance. That was in September, and I've had no reply from that either. So in terms of what people are asking in our community group, the answer is it's very hard to engage with the process.
Yes,
Yeah, I just want to echo, like, we've had the same issues. Basically, we know that, like, the developer that we're kind of involved with our application has had meetings with, like, offices, but we don't know when. We are never invited to these meetings. We are always, like, 3 steps behind in terms of information, on dates, on important policies that have to be compliant with, whereas they can be, like, very bendy for developers in a way. And also, yeah, I just want to reiterate, like, the importance of bringing communities in before. Like, everything we've done, we've been 3-4 steps behind, and it's been really, like, time-consuming, resource-consuming process that, like, the onus is always on community groups to, like, be proactive, but never on the developers, never on the councils or the GLA's way. And we'd like for that to just be evened out. Like, we're not asking for the GLA to do the work for us. It's just evening out the ground so we have a fighting chance in these, I guess, in these forums.
Mr. Catchpole.
Mr. Chairman, I'm from the Borough of Richmond in the area of Mortlake East Sheen, and we've seen 2 applications called in by the Mayor in recent years, one on the fringe of East Sheen at the home base site in Manor Road, and the other was the Mortlake Brewery. I think in answer to your question about the Mayor being so elusive, the thing that's really concerned us, going back to how the legislation came into being back in 2008, 2009, was the fact that the Mayor is operating on his own. That's the way it seems to come across. None of these applications actually get referred to the Planning and Regeneration Committee, whom we are looking at the moment, and thank you so much, incidentally, for inviting us in. We do wonder if there's any contact between the Mayor and any of you at all. When it comes to the public hearing, there he is, on his own. There may be 1 or 2 officers present. We never saw them at the Mortlake inquiry. We gathered they were hidden away somewhere. But that is something that's bugged us a bit, and we did wonder whether that part of the legislation needed to be looked at again. But the other thing I will say about these call-ins is that we do respect the GLA on one account, and that is that they do have the viability expertise that a lot of boroughs don't have. And they know what they're on about when they call in applications with a view to providing more affordable housing. But what we've seen happen in both these cases is a call-in where after about 2 or 3 months of meetings with developers, what has emerged is really a new scheme, not quite but almost twice the size of the original scheme, and that to us is a new application and ought to be treated that way as a new application with its associated consultation procedures. And these are material changes, and I just don't see how the Mayor can be allowed to call in an application as a continuation of the existing application that's already there. I might say more about that later, but anyway, that's for now.
So it's fair to say that you do you think that local residents, community groups should be given a greater role in deciding any of those amendments should they come forward to an original scheme? Or should we just not have amendments?
Oh no! If there are amendments to be made, yes, and we made a lot of noise about both applications. Amendments were made. In the case of the one in the home-based development in Manor Road, there were several rounds of amendments. Finally, there was a further amendment, and the public just weren't given enough time to respond on that one at all. It went straight to public hearing. Amendments are being made all the time, and we've just got to be aware of what's going on and be on our toes the whole time.
Thank you. Mr. Brearley, you wish to come in?
Thank you. Yes, about this question of engaging or trying to influence the Mayor's part in all this and the perception. Well, I spend much time speaking up via this Vital OKR Association for a community of businesses of which I'm a part. Run a business, manufacturing business there. A community of several thousand people in the Old Kent Road, so we're a good example. We happen to have a substantial industrial economy that's threatened by loss of accommodation, severe shortages and expulsion as a redevelopment frenzy goes on around us. The general perception is that the Mayor of London, in his planning role and with his big buckets of subsidy, is one of our principal adversaries. The Mayor works hand in hand with the local authority and their developer friends to drive through plans that will inevitably brush us aside, ignoring all the time key London plan priorities. We're weak, of course, and they are very strong. Our interests are routinely ignored and we have no voice nor a vote. In our case, we tried for 5 years to engage with the planning process, but it seems to be entirely futile, in fact, a humiliating waste of time. We perceive the Mayor as the most remote and opaque of those with power who are working against our interests. We can't figure out at all how to have any input to the Mayor's decisions. It doesn't seem to be possible to do that.
Thank you. Do you think the decision on, we've had a couple of contributions about it's only one person taking the decision. Should the final decision on planning approval be made by a wider group of people rather than just the Mayor?
Anything that sets up more opportunity for discussion of priorities and rights and wrongs would be better than what we have now, and anything that opens it up more, and anything that factors in this question of particular important issue, I think, that's been raised of bending the rules, which equals going against the principle of a plan-led system. I think it's in cases where proposals are significantly in contempt of plan, which is happening all the time. We've had 14 of those in the Old Kent Road area, approving 8,000 homes, all of them grotesquely in contempt of the development plan, including the new London plan. In those cases, we should find a way for much greater scrutiny, much greater debate, because we've effectively had our rights removed in those cases. And there it seems even more absurd that it just goes into a room that none of us can access, a process that we can't get into, and a decision from the mayor pops out. It just isn't right when you've even been denied a chance of speaking at an examination in public about a plan because it's already a done deal before the plan happens.
Thank you. Assembly Member Berry.
Chair, I wonder if we should address the question that was asked to us about whether or not we as a planning committee have a formal role to play in any planning decisions as currently stand. The way I understand it is, I mean, as individual assembly members, we can take up casework on planning applications that are referred to the mayor, and we do. I mean, there's a letter here from between me and you, Chair, on the Mortlake Brewery, where we wrote, while something was under consideration by the mayor, urging actually a delay in the process to allow more time for local residents to contribute. But I don't think even as a committee we're even informed officially or asked to comment or to take a view. I just wanted to just see if we can get that clarity in our terms of reference out in as part of this meeting.
Well, I don't want to make this Assembly members scrutiny, but
just to explain briefly as we can.
We just get notified like there's anything else. I think there's an email and it just says these things will be considered, but there's no effort to engage with Assembly members who either represent the area or the members of this committee.
If we were to comment as a committee, would that be within our terms of reference?
I believe when we've looked before that comes very close to not being in our terms of reference. I mean, that's the insanity of the rules under which we're covered.
We obviously can, yeah.
Can I call in Mr. Mobley first and then others? Mr. Mobley.
Hi, I'm from the East End Preservation Society, but I'm really here through my experience with call-in on the Bishopsgate goods yard. I was heavily involved in the second campaign on that, Stop the Monster, and that was a fairly unique example because it had originally been the developers had originally asked it to be called in while Boris Johnson was still mayor in 2014, I think, and Boris Johnson's own planning officer recommended refusal. So at that point, the developers deferred the application. I'd like to say they withdrew it, but it seems not because it came back in a couple of years ago. And it was in our view, a completely new application. It was nothing like the previous application, and yet it remained with the mayor. It should have gone back to the local authorities. It was hugely, the first scheme was hugely controversial, the second one as controversial. It absolutely should have gone back to the local authorities. One of the main reasons for that, as poor our experiences with local planning authorities in terms of local democracy, it's one step closer to the community than the level of the GLA. It really feels that keeping it with the GLA meant there were a whole layer of local input and local democracy was being avoided, actually. The scheme, in fact, Jules Pipe, when the first scheme was in, Jules Pipe at that time was mayor of Hackney, and he actually actively campaigned against it to the extent of commissioning an alternative scheme proposal himself, running poster campaigns on bus stops, this sort of thing, very, very actively, vocally campaigning against that scheme, the original scheme. By the time it came back, he was Sadiq Khan's planning deputy. Now, there are still statements of his on Hackney Council's website saying that if the application ever returns, it must go back to the local authorities. And yet, it was Jules Pipe himself, and there are minutes of meetings somewhere on the GLA website, who argued, when it did come back, that it should remain with the GLA. I mean, that's about as opaque and undemocratic as it gets, I think. There's been, and then in terms of the experience of interacting, there's been no interaction. I mean, this is fantastic, this opportunity today, but there was nothing like this. as part of that very opaque GLA process. Because it was effectively a new scheme, but remained with the GLA had to carry out the kind of functions that are normally done by local authorities. So normally, when a call-in happens, it's already gone through the local authority process and it's gone through local consultation. In this case, that didn't happen. The GLA effectively had to buy in expertise. They had to run their own consultations. That doesn't normally happen. The two local authorities' planning departments were asked to provide an opinion. And in both cases, it did go through a pseudo-planning process where it did go through to the planning committees in both cases. Both planning committees, Hackney and Tower Hamlets, objected to the scheme, the recent one. The planning case officer in Tower Hamlets, who I met about this early on in the process, was very, very unhappy with the way this had been done. He said this is really unusual. He's being asked to form an opinion on something he has no access to. He himself was saying that the process to him was opaque. He had no direct access to developers and he had no direct access to the community because we were asked to send out letters of representation through straight to the GLA. What else can I say? I mean, so on the day of the actual hearing, we had. There's no committee. It's one person. It's Sadiq Khan, and whoever his advisors are. Presumably, the main advisor is Jules Pipe, who we never spoke to at any part of this process. We were given, I think, 15 or 20 minutes. I think there was a little bit of generosity there. They extended it a bit for the number of objectors. Saif, I think you might have spoken at it as well. And yet the whole thing felt like a charade. It felt like we weren't being listened to. Sadiq Khan himself was incredibly rude to our own councillors, both Hackney and Tower Hamlets. Now, one of the arguments for keeping it with the GLA was political. We were told that now that Hackney is Labour, Tower Hamlets is Labour, the GLA is Labour, there's so much cooperation there going on that there's no need to return it to the local councils, but that certainly wasn't evident at the actual public hearing. Completely opaque. Ability to influence the process felt practically nil. I mean, we went through the motions, we got hundreds of letters of objection, we ran a fairly effective campaign, but I don't think we were being listened to at all. The other campaign I'm now involved in with some of the other people here is to do with the Old Truman Brewery development of an office block and shopping mall. That's been approved by Tower Hamlets Council, and we're right now in discussions, and Sean Berry's office is helping us with this, to see whether or not it could be called in. Although hearing the statistics about results from call-ins, it may be a question of going through the motions again, but I think anything that allows the public to continue being involved in debate is vital to this process.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Best, you came in. You wanted to come in?
Oh, yes, thank you. And good morning, everyone. And just to echo comments from earlier, thanks for being here with us. I wanted to ask a question, perhaps, that I was hoping I could get a yes-no across the board, slightly make sure everybody is getting a chance to contribute. So I just wanted to ask everyone, hopefully with a yes-no answer, do you have confidence in the decisions the Mayor makes as a result of the Stage 3 planning process? Perhaps starting from Heba on this side.
Thank you for that question. I mean, it's a bit of a tricky one because we're currently going through the process ourselves. I mean, we're trying to have confidence basically because it is our best fighting chance right now. So we're going in it with good faith. Like, we don't think that it's we're basically doing the best we can. And we're hoping that, like, as a result of this meeting and maybe us kind of continuing to lobby, it will kind of be a fair decision and a fair process. But yeah, statistically, it's been a bit of a hit and miss, I guess.
The question I posed, do you have optimism in having a favourable outcome? And the answer has got to be no, because the track record shows that once called in, it is called in to be approved. And that really does undermine the process. I admire people who go into it with optimism, I go into it with regression, which is basically to say we're going to fight this, and if need be, judicial review. Now, not everybody can do that. Fortunately, we persuaded our council to take it. But what happens, the decision gets taken again, but without the same mistakes. So I think what we did was to get a new case officer, a better report that justified the proposed decision. So I don't actually see extending it into a committee as helping that. It's like a one-party local authority where party loyalty dictates which way the decision goes. I can't see that changing, and I'm not actually maligning this mayor. It is just a fact of life that most of the call-ins are in order to enable them to go ahead, amended. And from my experience, yes, they did accept that it needed a new application, or at least to go in front of the local authority again. But the result was the same, it was just a better report.
So I'd like to get for everyone, so if we could just go yes, no for your confidence in the cooling process.
Well, the one word from me is no. Just to pack it out a little bit, I have no confidence in any of the mayor's decisions being taken on the basis of a commitment to fairness and civil rights as they relate to the planning process, particularly the relentless ad hocery of it, that the mayor, like everyone else, like local planning authorities too, seem to treat plans and the principle of plan comes first as an option. When they fancy, they follow it. When they don't, they don't. And I just don't know where that leaves anybody in confidence in the planning system, fairness and civil rights. So the mayor's part of a system that is really not fair. So I don't have any confidence in the decisions, even if some of them are good decisions. They're not done in a fair way.
My answer is no to the home-based development. When the brewery development got called in, I did a lot of research into all the other call-ins that had taken place, and they'd all been approved. And I found some of the approvals a little bit suspicious. My answer is no. But when it came to the brewery development, we worked very hard, and I was pleased with the results. Thank you.
My short answer is no, but I remain an optimist, and I'd just like to say the reason it's no is not necessarily because of politics or political affiliation or indeed fairness. I'm not even going to comment on that. My reason for not being confident is I actually feel the information he uses to make these decisions is often inappropriate and often out of date. And I can talk a bit more about that. This may not be the right question to respond to. I hope to get a chance just to register the point about impact assessments, which are these very large integrational documents. I really would like the opportunity a little later to talk about those. That inform these decisions, and my own personal experience with both health impact assessments, environmental impact assessments, transport impact assessments, is that in the period of call-in, they become out of date. And they often are based on data that has also been compromised in many ways. And again, I can give a bit more evidence about that later. And I'd just like to finally say that I do think those said impact assessments are an opportunity. And again, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. But for the moment, my answer is no, because I think he is being informed often in ways that are compromised.
Can I ask everyone to speed up?
Yeah, I was about to sorry to say I'm going to be getting evil eyes.
It's just that we're in danger of running over time. So if you could do that, I'll get to you in a moment. Is it on this?
It is very much on this, because while I don't want to cut anyone off, and I fully understand the point that Assembly Member Best is making, this is, we're here to hear ways that the process could be improved. And this is going to take a good chunk of time.
Yeah.
Where
so
I
the
think
point I've
the
just
points
made,
that could
the point
be...
I've just made is one you're making. Yeah. So if we could speed up very, very quickly and just have yeses and nos, if that's okay, and then we'll complete the round.
Do you think that's going to contribute to the outcomes of this committee?
If people stick to yes and no, because we're halfway there, halfway round.
Okay.
So next.
My name's Jerry Flynn. I'm from 35% Campaign, part of the Elephant Community Network, which campaigns for 35% affordable housing in Southwark. And my answer is more no than yes. We never give up hope.
Thank you. Sir?
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. I am representing State Watch, a support network for over 100 of London's council and housing association estates under threat of demolition. I am a leaseholder on the South Acton estate and will speak to this experience while making points that applies to many other estates. In December 2018, the Mayor of London approved demolition.
Excuse me, sir. Sorry, we're trying to get single replies to the question of whether or not you had confidence.
The nature of the question, for those who haven't spoken yet, puts this contradiction in point.
Can we get that out of the way first, or whether or not you have confidence, and we will get back to you.
Either we stop the process,
we will get back to you,
and we allow people to speak on a term that will give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. So maybe we should park this question, or give them the proper opportunity to speak to it.
I don't like to.
The groups going through a process to ask them whether they have confidence in the process. Yeah. I think, I really, as I say, I do understand what you're trying to do with this question, but I think it's inappropriately using the time we have, which is limited for lots of groups. We've had some really interesting and challenging stuff already. This attempt to get some sort of consensus from a group of community groups for your own purposes, I think is inappropriate.
I don't think that's what I'm trying to do, but I'd say I found these responses really quickly, really helpful, and actually it gives me a good sense of where everyone is on this panel, because so far we've heard some quite negative things, so I'd quite like to hear, if somebody says yes, I'd find that really interesting, because later perhaps I'd like to dig into how they have confidence, which is why I wanted to do a quick round. So perhaps maybe we could stop and just ask, does anybody have confidence?
Can I just make a comment? The only time I've had confidence is where, unfortunately, it was Boris Johnson, but when Boris Johnson was Mayor of London, he rejected the Queen's Market development in 2009-10, and that was a lot of effort on behalf of the community to get it to that point. But since then, we haven't heard very much to say yes.
Yeah. I remember that campaign with some fondness. It's not often you win, is it? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Natalia Perez from Latin Elephant. As Pat alluded to before, there were some concessions made following hard work and campaigning from the grassroots and from the community. So we recognize that positive aspect. However, you need to look at, I think, please consider looking at the amount of weight that's given to the voices of the officers. How can we hear from today's meeting that officers meet with the developer 20 times and not even once with a representative from the communities that know what's happening on the ground best? At the same time, what role does assembly members have to play in it? How come they're not consulted? They're also involved in the process, and they have to listen to the people that they represent and their constituents. So those voices are important in terms of assembly members. And also we've heard today how the process is definitely not accessible. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Lee?
Mine's more a request, Chair, that when we finish the question you're on now, would it be possible for those who haven't spoken yet to have a very few minutes to present our evidence to you? Because there's a few here who haven't spoken.
Absolutely will be, and we're just trying to get back on course. And then, Mr. Osmani, you indicated much earlier that you wished to speak on the previous item. Have you covered what you wanted to say?
Thank you very much. A lot of the campaigning we do for saving ethnic minority spaces in London is in our own time, so the resourcing isn't really there. And in a lot of ways, you've got the core question the GLA should be asking is, why is it that communities are fighting at core? What is the real impact of development as a whole? Because it's not just building developments, because local people think it's more than that. In fact, when you're developing, you're not just developing a building, you're actually destroying communities in the process. You're socially cleansing people, such as what's happening at Brick Lane. And at the same time, you're pushing a large-scale financial agenda onto communities which are often very poor and financially poor, but they're rich in terms of community value, they're rich in terms of social value, and all the other values such as creative value, which we all come to appreciate in London, which isn't really being factored or considered in anything that the GLA has come up with to date, because all they've ever done is focus on what the financial gain is, and we haven't looked at our lives purely through financial gain. So at core, the development process needs to go back to the drawing board and say, who is it that it's really serving? Because it's not serving Londoners presently. And my big issue here is that I have to really fight on a daily basis for these. The two main things that have come up for me as an artist and architectural designer is that the Brick Lane, a place where I do exhibitions, which is my social space and where I was born off of, is under threat because the city is creeping in to such a degree that there's a completely different style of development coming over. The retail plans haven't been considered. There's one-size-fits-all approach to everything that we see, and that is not the vision that the community wants. And why is it that the GLA and Mayor Sadiq Khan's office can't understand that? And why is it that certain things aren't in place? Why is it that the culture at risk group run away every time we ask difficult questions? And how can you retrospectively say to Londoners that we're going to sort your culture out afterwards while you destroy the culture in the process? There's something not right about that at core, you know? And I've noticed that there's pop-ups, sort of fake groups like On Red Church, which are organizations which are at core. There's developers who are funding that and are behind that, and they're the ones who receive the extra culture at risk money, and they're the ones who get traction. Now, there's huge disparities in the process within planning which serves its own friends as opposed to the local people, and the GLA need to be open and transparent about that because presently they're not. I've had to spend my time talk about housing on the Bishopsgate Goods Yard December last year. That fell on deaf ears. Mayor Sadiq Khan didn't listen to that. We've got housing needs. COVID has proven that our communities have been most hit by multiple social inequalities. Now, planning has an impact of that, and why have you, as the GLA, not addressed that on a massive scale? Instead, you're making small-scale sort of touch-ups. You know, there's huge amounts of money being made by these developers, millions every year, on the back of the local economy. They're not making it on the back of anything else. Everything else is speculative. So who's making those decisions for negotiating? For Queen's Market in Upton Park, the big issue we have is this good growth money as well. It's a regeneration funded pocket of money. Now, all they think about is regeneration. Forget the fact that during the lockdown, at the one end of Green Street, there were food banks where students from India were starving. We had to give them rice and packets of dal while they were starving at one end. The other end had Queen's Market, and thank God we had Queen's Market because our community wouldn't be starving as a result. And what happens? The planning department does not take that into consideration. Why? Because it's not aspirational. It's not development for them. But it is development because guess what? We're doing it for our community, and that's how our community is, and that's the way we develop. So maybe if they, or the GLA, I don't know where they shop or how they live, but it's certainly not how most Londoners live, okay? And we need to look at London as a city for everybody, not just for the rich. It's ridiculous. I mean, for every burger somebody eats, somebody has to toss that burger, and they might come from a different background. You know, none of that's being considered in the planning system. And the London plan in particular is responsible for that. Every 4 years, for the last 12 years, we've come along and we've tried to be heard on it, and no one's listening. Why are we constantly bashing against a glass door? I mean, you're showing transparency, and there isn't any transparency in your process.
Thank you very much for those words. Assemblymember Berry.
We've heard quite a few people say that they've struggled to get in touch with the planning officers, or they've tried to get in touch with the deputy mayor to have a meeting and not managed it. But we've also heard that people making the plans, the developers, the applicants, are having lots of meetings with those people. I just wanted to ask, in terms of the transparency of that, Have any of
Assembly
you...
Member Berry, you're actually sort of stepping into the next section.
I think I was trying to work out whether or not...
If that's the case, Chair, I'll be happy to take over and move on to the next section.
Yeah, no, I just thought that this is... I mean, this isn't about the... The next section is all about the process that you take part in, and I'm asking about the transparency of the process that you don't take part in, and whether or not
All right, let's go for it.
anyone has managed
It's
to
probably
get
due to move on to that
released. Can I ask if anyone, just put your hands up if you want to say something about it, has managed to get information released about the content of the meetings that do take place between the Mayor's team, the planning officers and the applicants? Is that process transparent? I know it's not published, but has anyone managed to get hold of it through like FOI, or is it regarded as confidential? Claire?
We got it, as I said earlier, in Mortlake. We got it as part of an FOI. But again, that, I find that problematic. It had to go via FOI.
Yeah.
Also, Louise from the Spitalfields Trust. Yes, for Norton Folgate, which is a big development in Spitalfield, similarly through FOIs we got information, but not published minutes or anything like that.
We'll release them if you ask on an FOI.
In that instance,
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Can we now move to the next section, which is about the opportunities for community engagement, and this section will be taken by Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, once again, reiterating the thanks for everyone's time today. I think this is kind of actually, this section, the core of what we're here to discuss. Like, what does it look like to be meaningfully engaged and heard and being able to shape the process? And that's what we're aspiring to improve. I have a little text that I'm due to read, and I'll read that in just a moment. In fact, I'll start with that, and then I'll kind of add to that what I wanted to kind of frame the next set of questioning around. It says, community engagement is a crucial component of the planning system. It helps to ensure that local people have a voice in developing the communities they live and work in, and also increases the transparency and legitimacy of the planning process. I don't think anyone here is going to be arguing with that. During the mayoral call-in process, groups and individuals are able to speak or object to applications in the first two stages of the process, and can also request to speak at representation hearings, where they are given a maximum of 15 minutes to speak as a group. However, supporters and objectors are not invited to attend site visits. Now, a lot of what was just said in that is stuff that's already been teased out a little bit from everyone's contributions. And again, very grateful for the specificity of some of the examples. I think one thing I just wanted to almost bring the kind of meeting back to, I guess, the original context in which myself and the committee sat down in order to invite you to. Myself as a Labour member, Andrew Boff as a Tory member, Sian Berry as a Green member, so the three political groups represented on the committee, we kind of all came together independently and said, this is exactly what we want to do. We want to bring everyone round the table. We want to hear from your experiences. We want to learn from your experiences of what's gone wrong. And the purpose of today is really constructively thinking, we are all really invested. We're policy geeks, we love it, but we're also really invested in making the change that's necessary to protect, uplift, support, and engage the communities that, for instance, Seth has just very, delicately discussed, and give space for those communities to flourish and thrive. And I don't think anyone is going to pretend that planning hasn't at any point locally caused some form of contention. And I think, therefore, it's important for us to always put this in the wider context, the wider political context about ultimately planning laws coming from national government. And for me, as someone who's also a local councillor, feeling often very frustrated about the processes of viability assessment, and feeling like generally the planning system is tipped in the favour of developers. I agree with you, Seth, that developers are getting rich in this city and beyond because they are given the space to create an expectation where their profit is protected before we negotiate affordable housing. And I think that's totally unacceptable. And I think that falls at national government, and I think that falls at national policy. And we have to put that in this context when we fight for change and we ask for change, so that our strategy and our policy is interlinked and pulls at all the appropriate political levers. I would also go on to say, I'm not here to defend, or none of us are here to defend or support or have a go at any particular politician. We are really interested whether this scans this mayor, the last three mayors, the process of call-in. And we're really invested in having that, to be honest, changed. I think there's a consensus in the committee that the call-in process isn't fit for purpose at the moment. I think that's why we've invited you here, because we've heard from our constituents over months, and I've only been here for 6 months, but it's been very loud and clear to me as soon as I've landed here that the calling process doesn't work. So let's talk about how we make it work. And I think that it's natural that we stray into experiences, both with this mayor or the past mayor, about frustrations, and that is appropriate, but I also want us to just be anchored in how we can improve it. So although I know that there are aspirations, both from whether that's the Deputy Mayor Jules Pipe or the current Mayor Sadiq Khan, for community engagement, whether that's outlined in the London plan or in subsequent documentation, aspiration is one thing, and what happens in reality can sometimes be different, and I respect everyone's experiences who might describe those things as different. So thank you for sharing them, and we are here to move into a point. I'm getting to the questions. I'm getting to the questions, Chair. I'm getting to the questions. But we are here to talk about how we can make those changes. So I welcome that. Now, on to the actual questions, and if it's all right, I'll lead off with Claire, because I have you down as someone who's going to respond to this first. Is what do you think about the process of the GLA representation hearings? So that's obviously once it's called in. We most recently had from Stag Brewery one where I was sat in the audience, so it'd be really good to hear about your experiences of how you find the process, and please feel free to draw on answers you've already given and those from that we've heard from others as well.
Thank you, and it's an opportunity for me to introduce myself. Excuse me, my name's Claire Delmar, and I'm probably representing the newest organization here because I set up Listen to Locals in March this year. And it's very relevant because it was in response to the mayoral call-in. We were in Mortlake with a planning application sitting here in City Hall, and we didn't need any more support locally because everybody was very much in favor of turning down this application. So we needed a wider voice, and I was getting approached by lots of different groups across London saying, yeah, we're in the same boat. There was lots of similarities. So Listen to Locals is now a collective of community organizations. Initially, we had a few hustings, and again, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think it's important to put it out because both Andrew and Sean were involved in those hustings. They were both GLA hustings and mayoral candidate hustings with a complete focus on community participation and planning. And I think the outcome, and I remember, Andrew, you actually saying this phrase, to quote you in a podcast, we just achieved this high level of consensus, which is great, and we're all happy about that, but now what do we do with that? And I think the term community engagement is a bit like, in the United States we say motherhood and apple pie, yay. But, now how do we find those channels and what do we actually see as the real opportunities? So Listen to Locals has kind of morphed from, turning community engagement and planning onto the agenda. The answer to that was, yes, it should be on the agenda. Yes, it's important. We all are in agreement on that. To now being what I would describe as on a mission to seek evidence and opportunities for this community engagement and to look for the positive and to be constructive. So on that note, there's a number of things I could speak to, back to your question, but the thing I want to highlight is something I alluded a few minutes ago with regard to the other question around process, and that is this point about impact assessments. And I just want to make a couple points because this could be interrogated forever, and I don't want to do that. But these call-ins, what's ironic about them is they take the same data that was already interrogated at the local authority level. And meanwhile, if you think about it, time has passed, circumstances have evolved. And so if you think about the Mortlake Brewery, which is what I can speak to and how I actually began to develop this particular interest, the health impact assessment, I'm just taking that one. There's health, there's environment, there's transport, there's a number. But I'm going to focus on health because it's something that I think everybody in this room cares about. It's something that public awareness is at a particular high point around. The mayor called this project in. This was a development that was going to increase the local population by 90%. So just to clarify, 90. It's a pretty big increase in local population. The health impact assessment was dated October 2019, pre-pandemic, and this was what he was using to inform him on this decision to increase our local population. This was an outdated piece of documentation that was going to have an impact on local public health, yet the information which was informing him was outdated. I then sent in a number of requests to please update this to the planning case officer. I never heard back, but then when I kept checking the website, the GLA website, I found in September that the said health impact assessment had indeed been updated to July 2020, but then when I went through it, it was the same document. So I think that's all I want to say about the kind of the bad things about health impact assessments. There's clearly room for improvement. And I could go on about transport and environment, but in the interest of time, I won't. But what I really want to say is that I think that, again, using health as a specific, there is an enormous opportunity for those very, very processes, those very, very levels of interrogation to bring community members in. I think this on a number of levels. I think that people care about their health, so while they might be bored of planning or they might think that the mayor's stacking the decisions against them, they might have negative perceptions, we used that word earlier. You know, when you talk about health, that most people want to engage around that. And probably around environment and transport too, but I'm just speaking around health. So I think it's a channel to bring people in. The second thing I want to say is that there's actually a lot of money around, believe it or not, in a lot of the organizations within the NHS that procure health, and that it's very disjointed. So when I went to look at the health impact assessment back in Southwest London, I actually spoke to both the primary care providers as well as the primary care purchasers. And both of them made it very clear that they were against this development, and they had made that patently clear to both the applicant consultant who was writing the report. It was never reflected in the said report. And then I just want to say one final thing about the reports. Most of these reports are what I would call risk mitigation exercises. So the impact assessment is about identifying risks and basically saying as an applicant, this is how we're going to mitigate said risks. Now, if you think about that, that may not be bad, but what is lacking is there's a tremendous opportunity to actually take those risks and say, we can actually, through this regeneration scheme, through this redevelopment scheme, we can actually make this community healthier. We can actually promote well-being. We can actually do this so much better. But there's none of that. It's all about how we're not going to put more burden on the local primary care provider or how we're not going to compromise air quality. And I don't think that's helpful, and it's a very costly exercise. And final point, those reports are all done remotely by a group of a consulting industry, with no disrespect to them. But they're partially culpable here too in bringing in, whether it's neighborhood groups, community groups, patient groups, to actually pull people in through different channels to actually create a better impact assessment that reflects the reality of what's happening in our community and how this development is going to impact it. I mean, my colleague over here said in his case over in Spitalfields, there was no attention paid at all to the cultural impact of a big redevelopment scheme. I mean, health, transport, you name it. These are not just buildings. And these reports play a substantial role in informing decisions. So that would be what I see as something that needs looking at, but also provides a tremendous avenue and a very powerful channel for a whole range of groups to get better involved and to create ultimately, I think, better information for these decisions.
Thank you, Claire. I appreciate that answer. I'm going to bring in, I know there might be people who actively want to speak, but maybe those who, for instance, Cube, who got kind of caught in the middle in the section below, above rather, and maybe Seth as well, if I could bring you both in around the representation hearings at the GLA, those that you either have a perception of, have been part of, or have heard of, in terms of things that you think are good and things that you think need to improve. And if I might be bold enough to offer some examples, I mean, even from what you've said, Claire, I don't think community groups should have to trawl a website to get information. I think there should be a really clear identification of who the officers are. I think there should be very clear, constant communication, to the point where you might even have each other's numbers. I'm not actually putting that out there as a suggestion, but I'm saying if, absolutely, Hibba, what you've identified as community groups and SEF are doing this on their own time more often than not. This is free labour. This is often people who don't have technical experience of the planning system because it is very technical heavy. And I think the website should be the last place that you go to get information, not the first. So that, for me, is an example of something that could improve. An example of something that maybe is currently done well. So when I did watch the Stag Brewery hearing, for instance, I thought it was excellent, mostly through your self-organisation as a group, that you had lots and lots of people coming to give your objections from a variety of the community, and the mayor offered up much more time for that objection than is done at local council level. And I thought that was really effective and important and necessary and enabled significant and appropriate objection, which ultimately I think swayed the decision. So just given sort of like things that can improve, things that are good, things that should be retained, and your general perceptions of the GLA hearings and how engaged communities are around them. Yakub and then Seth and then anyone else who wants to come in, if that's okay.
where I want to speak about, briefly is.
And sorry, just before I
about
interrupt you, because I know that your last introduction did get interrupted. So if you want to start again and give us your introduction from where you've come from and what you want to say.
Okay, all right, yes. Okay, good morning again. I'm representing State Watch, also South Acton State. In December 2018, the Mayor of London approved demolition of 2,100 homes on the South Acton Estate, where I live. The Mayor of London provided funding without a ballot and without our voices. Following a decision by the Mayor, planning permission was granted for 2,350 new homes, of which only 796 will be social rented or London affordable rent. The Section 106 agreement defines social rent at anything up to 80% market rent. The realities of people actually moving to the new homes, they are actually paying more in rents, service charges, and bills. There are many parts of this decision that I disagreed with, but especially that the mayor's is agreeing state regeneration when it doesn't follow his own policy requirements. I read the mayor's state regeneration good practice guide with a lot of interest. It is an excellent guide. However, it's not referred to when mayors make decisions on planning permissions, and no attention is given to the real resident experience on the ground. First, as required by the mayor's guidance, there should be an awareness campaign of the pros and cons of redevelopment and demolition at the beginning. One can only know the actual cost of gentrification when one lives through it. Community breakdown, disturbance of family quality life, stress, depression, mental health risk, loss of normality of life, disrepair, removal of services as normal, so-called market valuations, known as market price, but without empowering and without the capability to repurchase within the same postcode. Inequalities of access to independent experts. For example, the council would have its own surveyors, and freeholders and leaseholders would have an independent surveyor, but paid by the council, a compromise. Power cuts, heating and hot water interruptions, living life in limbo. I'll say that again, living life in limbo. It's not easy. For many years. Dust, debris, which may include asbestos, vibrations, shakings of the buildings, pollution because of diesel used machineries and generators, noise pollution, climate change, demolition very costly to environment. The realities of consultations are cosmetics. Residents are not empowered or notified clearly and are usually tricked instead of engaging them when it comes to planning permissions. Non-existent support for temporary and private tenants affected. For inequalities of power in negotiations and CPO processes. Major demolition in South Acton is done without a ballot. Over the years, residents and families like myself have invested heavily in places where we live as families, alongside with neighbors and communities. As a result, we have put a considerable amount of investment in terms of lifelong livings, beyond financial investments, going to local shops, GPs, schools, religious places, sporting activities, meeting our neighbors. We're working with local youth and elders. We appreciate sometimes there may be a need for redevelopment if it includes and rewards the existing residents. We are investing heavily. Regeneration can be delivered if that's the case. The mayor's policy of like-to-like replacement of home is a step in the right direction. Currently, leaseholders with a mortgage or not, also freeholders, we own 100% of our home. We face the current lockdown violations following a managed rundown of buildings. As I said, earlier, with services being removed, disrepairs. We did not own 25%, 50%, 60% of our home. Instead, we bought our home, 100% of it, in the free market, thinking and assuming it would be a home for our children's lifetime. We find that the only option for leaseholders to stay in the area is through the shared equity schemes, which doesn't even allow succession to our children. We find the shared equity offer doesn't satisfy the mayor's good guidance of like-to-like. If anyone with power will take my home, the only solution is to replace my house on a like-with-like basis in the same postcode area, and then add on the compensation and the disturbance cost.
Yakub, if I could ask you to bring your comments to wrap up so I could bring in Seth as well.
Yeah, not too long. Yeah.
No, go for it.
Yeah. We know everyone had given leaseholders the least priority in the past, but that needs to change and be fair. In this case, the developers need our home to make a profit and to build more homes. They should allow us to share the benefits and be part of that regeneration as they take what is ours. Good guidance for regeneration has always been that it should never involve a total clearance. 50% each, retention and demolition. The mayor needs to make sure the borough follows his policies and guidance. The mayor should be monitoring the whole process. I'm living in a bad situation where it rains inside my building, where there are guard dogs outside for at least a week, even though it was needed for longer. The impact of demolition going on around me is terrible. Communication with me is very poor or non-existent. I have experienced multiple CPOs with all of them with administration errors. I was expected to make an objection within 20 days. Since June 16th, I haven't had a reply. Our homes are being ripped apart from us to something that doesn't measure to what we put in. At the bottom of your heart, I'm hoping that you can see families, neighbors, and communities are being apart as well. People's lives are being destroyed. Finally, if you allow me 30 seconds. The people leading the regeneration industry. If someone says they want your home for whatever reason, what do they expect? Really, the home to be replaced. Those of us living in council estates, we are asking for that, and we are losing out a lot, and it needs to be compensated. Thank you.
Can I just say thank you very much, because I know you're speaking personally, and it's very difficult to speak personally about your experience of feeling under threat and your home feeling under threat, and that takes a still stomach. So I'm very grateful for your honesty and the detail in which you shared with the committee. Yakub, I will say that personally I'm strong agreement with you around estate balloting. Absolutely, where estate balancing is remitted, i.e. they have had access to GLA funding, it should be done properly. I would like to see an expansion of estate balloting. I think every development, when we're locking down houses, should be balloted. I would like to see national government follow Sadiq's lead on that and actually say estate balloting should always happen, and then also look at when it is happening and say, how do we make sure it's happening properly? I will be clear that this is a session on call-in, and estate balloting is a separate issue. However, it is totally related because it is within the broader remit of this Committee of Planning and Regeneration, and actually a lot of what you've described is the beginning of what many people term gentrification. And actually what I think would be good within the remit of this investigation is to think about, should there be mechanisms to quantify potential future effects of gentrification, and should that be integrated into the call-in system? Should that be part of the policy criteria for when you call in an application, being able to quantify future gentrification effects? I think this is probably a question that will come under the section that Assembly Member Berry will deal with in the third questioning. So I will just bring us back to the GLA representation hearings, and I'll be passing over to Assembly Member Baker to continue this question if they want to comment at all on it. But before that, Seth, please, your thoughts on it.
Thanks very much. Really good points made by Jakob. I think the big thing that stands out for me is the planning system presently, and the GLA's role within the planning system is actually disempowering for communities. And that's largely, if you look at nowadays, a lot of the planning documents and our engagement has been reduced to a PDF, which we then download online and somehow are supposed to read all of these amazingly written, beautifully versed words, which are becoming increasingly meaningless, like words like diversity have in fact started to mean something very different now. And words like affordable, nobody actually knows what it means. So I think that's certainly something that really needs to be looked at. And through that as well, our communities are the GLA and the planning system is actively digitally disengaging people and excluding people from the planning process by not allowing them in. So where you've got communities with social inequalities, the means aren't there for them to access all of that complex information through whatever means. It's not a case of just giving them laptops. It's a case of really understanding how they as a community engage, and that could be in multiple formats. It could be in different ways. It could be resourcing more directly rather than to councils directly, which I don't think is a good idea. In some councils, East London, is very questionable whether they should get any more money in regards to engagement. In terms of the case for Queen's Market, the co-producing and the co-designing of this is really questionable when they've only engaged with locals a couple of 100 meters away. They said that other people can't have an input. Why is that? Why is it that we can get fancy consultants from Hackney and the latest architects, but we can't engage our wider community, which rely on a local resource? Now, that comes down to the fact that the GLA has actually given them money for the first time and has been poverty washing, in fact. And a lot of what's happened is there's been a managed neglect of some of our public assets. Now, we need to look at that process and how that's happened and how the planning system encounters and allows for that to happen. Because it's not just about pre-war Victorian homes that are important and beautiful buildings with lovely edgings and covings and fixtures. It's actually about the entire architectural language that we know as the skyline of London. It's not about Dubai on Thames with a forefront of Old English buildings. It's about what happened post-war and pre-war, and that includes the arrival of the ethnic minorities into Britain. It's not about whitewashing them out of here through gentrification. And I think that's very much racialized when you look at how planning is actually a very archaic and Victorian or really old system that needs to shift massively. What I'm really disappointed with generally with the planning system is the over-reliance on the data in terms of financialization, but we're one of the world's...
Mr. Osmani, we have a specific function to talk about the call-in process.
Yeah, so...
We could certainly have a discussion about the London plan. That would take much longer, and it wouldn't allow some of these other voices to come in. I do apologise, and I sympathise with what you're saying, but this is about the call-in process.
Yeah, so, I mean, in terms of the call-in process, I think the thing that annoys me most is about this lack of evidence shown from things like sociologists and people like that when it comes to impacts on local on local people, especially when you look at the fact that London is like a major global city, and that's not really there. So essentially for me, the main thing is also looking at the other process of whether privatization is really the way forward. So that a lot of transparency
again,
around that.
these are broader issues than the calling powers. And you've got a forum here, and you're going to use it, but it's about the calling powers.
Well, it doesn't come around that often.
Absolutely. Mr. Lee, you indicated. Would you mind?
Please.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would very much like to speak on the engagement questions with regard to referral and calling. I haven't spoken yet, so would it be all right if I just quickly introduced?
Please do.
So I'm here representing Just Space, which is a network of community groups across London. We're very actively involved when it comes to the London plan, as some of you will know. and through our work, over 60 community groups took part in the examination in public, which really illustrated a thirst from the community side to engage in these types of processes. Because of that involvement, the London Plan is very important to us. We think it's a very important document, and therefore its implementation and the whole role of referral and calling by the mayor is an extremely important process. We can't just spend years trying to influence the policy in the London Plan if actually we can't take part in an equally fruitful way in the actual implementation. So this is, the subject matter today is really important to us. And above all, we feel that the public trust and confidence in London planning is not well served by the way in which the process operates at the moment. And if it fails the test of public trust and confidence, then really it is fair to say it's not fit for purpose and it needs to radically change. So, just if I may make a few proposals on this matter that we've considered, and I think on the criteria for schemes that are called in, this seems to us an extremely important area. Because, for example, we heard from Jakob just requesting that the mayor's policies on estate regeneration and the policy guidance should be a matter that the mayor gives full attention to when considering referral and calling. And I wasn't sure that was embraced after Jakob had spoken. I would argue it should be a core purpose of the referral and calling process, because what is more important to Londoners than their home and the potential loss of their home? Why wouldn't a mayor that's for Londoners actually make use of referral and calling to ensure that there's fairness and equality within the whole approach to people and their home? So it just strikes us in Just Space and Estate Watch that this is one example. There's many more that you've heard, but one important example where actually a key policy of the mayor in the London Plan and in guidance is not actually being properly monitored when it comes to referrals and callings. So that leads us to our first proposal, which is around the criteria for calling. And we feel that yes, for us, unfortunately, we don't live under a planning system where policies are binding. Many of us wish we did, but that's not the planning system we operate under. So therefore, there's always going to be a certain amount of trade-off. But the issue is that the trade-off has to be transparent and it has to pass the test of public confidence. So we would argue that the citizens and the community groups should be an arbiter in the decision around whether a scheme is called in. And the way that we would like to see that happen is through the role of a petition, that we should have the power to petition the mayor and the GLA when it comes to stage 2 and stage 3, and say that, in our view, very, very significant policies in the London Plan are not being met by this planning application. Therefore, we petition you to call this in. To us, that's almost common sense, but it's not part of the existing system. So it's giving that right by petition for the public to say, doesn't meet policy. You may not have picked that up, but we should have the right to pick it up for you, and therefore you should be required to call in on receiving a petition from the public for non-compliance with key policy in the London Plan. We also think that all the points that have been made around communication and the rights of citizens really need to lead to changes in terms of the negotiations that are taking place at stage 2 and leading up to the stage 3 calling. We know that there's lots of these discussions taking place, as Claire has referred to, and they just must be transparent. And this is partly about really upping the game in terms of the access to information on the GLA website. Big room for improvement there. But as other voices here have said, you shouldn't have, as a member of the public, you shouldn't have to know your way around the GLA website in order to really find out what's going on. So those who live in the area of a scheme, those who are affected, particularly by a scheme, there has to be a complete change in the communication process so that people are automatically receiving information about any revisions, any changes, stage 2 and stage 3 processes. The final point, because I know you don't want me to speak for too long, but I must comment on this question around who is the arbiter, who is involved, because I thought it was a very interesting question that you raised about should this be left to one person, or if not, how might it be done? And for Just Space, we celebrated the return of London governance in 2000. We supported this. We wanted to see the GLA, the London Assembly members, the mayor. There was a huge gap when that's not here. But in Just Space, we felt let down since then, because we see the London Assembly as timid. Sorry to say it, but we see the London Assembly as very timid, and it's part of a whole system of governance and decision making at the GLA, which is very weak in our view. We would like to see you as Assembly members having a full scrutiny role, because that's your main purpose, scrutiny. And yet, where is your scrutiny role when it comes to stage 2 and calling? There doesn't seem to be. So, at least in terms of matching what the current system requires of the Assembly, there really needs to be an increase in your role and powers, inverted commas, when it comes to the scrutiny of the referral and calling process. We would like it to go further. We don't see why we have one system at a local authority level where clearly the public elects their representation of councillors, and the councillors perform many different functions, whether it's as members of the executive, whether it's as scrutineers, whether it's exercising their own calling function at a local authority level. So we think there's an argument that we should look actually at your role as London Assembly members and as a functioning committee in the actual decision making and consideration of callings. Why should it just be left to the mayor on his or her own? Why not have a more collective approach to this? It would seem to us quite obvious within a representative democracy that we move in that direction. And of course, we would like to see, as I mentioned through the petition, a greater empowerment for the community so that we're part of that decision-making process as well. I do have one or two other proposals, and I hope I may have a briefer chance to touch on those before we finish today.
Richard, I think you will. I think as the chair described earlier, there's 3 sections. So we've done the first section that the chair talked us through. I'm going to finish off on this section, and then Assembly Member Berry is going to take over on the 3rd section, which is a slightly more broader space in which we would welcome some more of your recommendations. I personally found it fascinating to hear the expansion from your side of what you think the calling criteria should be, and I fully embraced what we heard from Yaqub, because I think actually you were spot on, Yaqub, in terms of how we need to expand and empower communities to be part of expanding the criteria for call-in, whether that's through petition or whether that's through quantifying gentrification future effects. I know Assemblymember Berry wants to comment on a specific process point. Just before I bring you in, Assemblymember Berry, if it's okay, we are needing to wrap up this section now, and the next section, like I said, is a lot broader. So those of you who haven't spoken enough or would like to add more will have space to do that. But just before we finish off on the section around the hearings, so the specific hearings, when an application has been called in and the process of community engagement. And one of the questions we have here, for instance, is like site visits, whether that should be automatic, whether the applicants as well as the community group should be given an equal footing in terms of visiting the sites with the GLA officers, and also how we balance and ensure that those who are contributing to supporting or oppositional to applications are from as diverse a community background as possible. So how does community engagement at the moment look in terms of ensuring a diversity of those round the table, and how can we improve them? So these are some of the questions that are still kind of hanging over this section. And Assemblymember Assemblymember Baker, I wasn't sure if you wanted to add some of the questions so we can group them, put them to you, and then I can pass over to Assemblymember Berry.
Chair, sorry, you're not the chair at the moment. I just wanted to say, rather than let my point of information, because that's what it is, get separated in the transcript by another topic, I would like to please intervene if that's okay to ask. I'm really sorry. I just wanted to refer back to what Richard was saying, and Jakob also, about bringing the estate guidance into planning rules. And I think you're right, Richard, that it is planning guidance, but I think I've asked and challenged the Mayor previously about that issue, and I think it's worth us revisiting that, maybe offline, maybe not as part of this investigation. But in terms of this investigation, I have a point of information, which is that the Assembly Housing Committee did make a previous recommendation alongside that the Mayor should use his funding guidance to try to ensure more things were taken into account, particularly equalities duties. And we discussed the fact that the socio-economic duty is not currently there within the Equality Act. And I think that would deal with a lot of the issues that are there. And I wonder if this committee might look again at that previous recommendation from the Housing Committee when we're considering our recommendations. There is a Mayor's response to that as well.
Thank you, Chair. Not Chair. Thank you, Assemblymember Berry. Sounds like that's something for us to go away and look at. So yeah, just back to the kind of collected, summarised questions that I was just hoping we could finish off this particular aspect of the questioning on. And Assemblymember Baker, to hand over to you to add to that.
So there are some follow-up, very, very specifics, but I know we're right up against the time now. So they were about site visits, about the experience of representation hearings, actually going through that, and the time you have to prepare for representation hearings. Do you want to open that out, or should we ask whether there's anything specific they feed back to us? Because I know we're right, in writing, because we're right up against time. Up to you.
Throw the question out there now
sure.
and expect written responses.
That's fine. So yes, I know we've covered this in some of you have covered in this, but the specifics around representation hearings. Do you feel that you have access to site visits when they're done as part of the call-in process? How do you feel the process of representation hearings in calling, those of you who've gone through it, and whether you have sufficient time to prepare? Is there anyone who has anything specific to contribute on that? Jonathan?
Yeah, a couple of things. So this is thinking again about the goods yard experience. The site visit. What site visit? There was a site visit for the. I would have said for the committee, but there isn't a committee in the case of call-ins. There was a site visit, Sadiq Khan. Even our own Assembly member, Unmesh Desai, wasn't aware of this visit. It was that opaque. That's all I want to say about that. Obviously, we didn't get to see the site. Then on the actual business of the public hearing itself and the case officers. So case officer report was published. I can't remember the details, but presumably a week before. In terms of what Sadiq Khan's exposed to, presumably his main exposure, apart from input from Jules Pipe, is the case officer's report. The case officer report, in many parts, read like a sales brochure for the developers. There were hundreds of representations submitted, and obviously there was the opinions of both Hackney Council and Tower Hamlets Councils, case officers and committees, and the report really just washed over the whole lot of it, and it really did. It lifted sales phrases from developers' publications. It comes out a week before the hearing, so your only real chance, although you can. I can't remember again. I assume we probably did write in making various points about that, and there were factual errors in the case officer's report, which were never resolved. There were errors in terms of who groups were representing, which was never resolved. The only chance you really have to pick up on issues in the case officer's report is actually when you have your 5 minutes to speak at the hearing. And at that hearing, the experience was pretty awful for everyone, because Sadiq Khan we really got the impression he was pretty impatient with the whole process. You got the impression he felt the whole thing was getting in the way of a decision that he probably already had made. He was quite rude to everyone, including our own councillors and case officers. But points where there was one particular point I remember that I made, which was really important, that the affordable or social housing offer on the new scheme was less than the social housing offer on the previous scheme from a few years before. Even though the total amount of housing was much less, the actual social housing offer, the previous scheme was a housing-led scheme. The percentage that was social housing was a tiny percentage, because it was all luxury housing. Although the percentage had gone up on this scheme, the actual amount of housing had gone down. We waited years for that kind of outcome. That's a sort of point that there should have been more time to I think the case officer report, there should be time for that to be properly interrogated and challenged, and there should be an interactive session like this after the case officer's report has been published. It shouldn't be left to people to spend 5 minutes on the day that the decision is being made. And then, just one more point about the idea of a petition and the deciding on a call-in. The one that we're looking at now is the Truman Brewery campaign that received, Tower Hamlets Council received 7,500 letters, individually written letters of rejection, not a petition, written letters. 140 traders, Brick Lane traders, submitted a letter, and we also have 550 to 600 local residents living immediately around Brick Lane who submitted a letter of representation. These figures are unheard of. Those numbers probably carry no weight at all in determining whether this application should be called in. We are hoping for it to be called in, and Sean Berry's office is helping us look at how to interpret that request. We've written a letter to Sadiq Khan. Anyway, we'll see how it goes.
Will Mr. Catchpole indicate?
Yes. Site visits, we were not allowed to participate, but we went to town and put stake boards up all over the place, massive posters and so on. I think the mayor might have noticed that. When it came to the public hearing itself, we were very grateful to the GLA for giving us 25 minutes, not 15. But even in 25 minutes, although we had 9 speakers, there were a whole lot of issues that we simply did not cover. We had a secondary school proposed on the site, that wasn't covered at all. 5 acres of playing fields, no coverage of that either. Claire mentioned the health impact, that was hardly covered. Flooding, that's a big issue, that wasn't covered at all. There are a lot of other things that were simply not covered. So we need more than 25 minutes, but you gave us 25 minutes and we made the most of it.
Can I just add to that?
One other final thing, yes,
Yep.
you can, but one final thing is the visual displays at the public hearing. There were none. There weren't any at the planning committee meeting in Richmond either. We saw a lot of the architects' drawings, developers' stuff and so on, but nothing from us. We tried to get photographs of traffic congestion in the morning peak, problems with the level crossings at Mortlake and so on. It wasn't allowed at the planning meeting in Richmond. Here, what did happen was that we were allowed to submit photographs, and they went into a sort of a pack for the mayor to see, which is good. But it would have been a lot better if it had actually been on the screen so that everybody could have seen them. That's it. Thank you. You wanted to add something?
Yeah, just to add on that point, I just want to clarify between the site visits. There are in fact two, and one was the mayor, which Tim was referring to, and that was unannounced, and no one was able to engage with that, as he said. But there was another visit with two case officers. I was involved in that visit, and I just also want to say that was actually instigated and organized by one of your assembly members, the assembly member for Southwest London, Nicholas Rogers. So he actually organized that visit with the case officers. They came, I was party to that. But again, it was something we had to arrange, and through the channel of the assembly. So well done to you and him for that. It did happen, but just wanted to add that because there were two separate visits.
Yep, thank you. That's really helpful. And Patricia, I think, is the last person we have in this section. Is that correct?
Sorry, did you indicate? I do apologise.
Sorry. Yeah, I want to come into the time to prepare. Is that all right? Representations. Partly because, yes, time is crucial, but it's not all about time. It's also about the resources that are available for communities. And here I want to think about how communities sort of, and our experience in gathering, but also in how we present this evidence. So I think it's important to think about parity and equity in terms of evidence, but also expertise that is brought to these hearings. When we have resource poor community groups, how are we going into this? We're already with few steps behind a lot of the other people or stakeholders in these applications. So how can we balance? And I think it's a question for all of us. How can we balance up the disparity, the inequity of resources at these hearings? Should there be funding for local groups, to pay what they think is their designated experts, right? They decide who their experts are. So that when we go to these forums, we are à la par, if not with these other sort of experts and stakeholders. And I say this because a lot of the time, our experience and our evidence is dismissed as anecdotal. And so there's also another point here to be made about the type of evidence that is accepted and not accepted at these hearings as well. So it's more than just about the time for these presentations, but it's about how we prepare for this presentation and the fact that we should have the funding made available for us to come at the same level as all these other people who have sometimes 10 people behind them, backing them, experts in every area with all the numbers and figures, but not the experience of what actually means to lose one's home or one's place.
Good.
Thank you very much. I think, should we bring...
Well, there's Miss Ahmed, perhaps?
I'm very happy to keep, the answers going as long as you're fine, Chair, with us staying in the section. Sorry? I can't hear you with your mask on, sorry.
Oh, of course it is. We are running out of time for this section, so if we can move rapidly on to the next.
Yeah, no, I was going to say either I can bring in Hibber or we can move into the next session and
Let's move on to the next section if we
Is that all right,
can.
Hibber?
And you will have an opportunity.
The next
Everyone
session is
have an
quite broad,
opportunity.
so hopefully it'll give people, especially those, I know there's a few who haven't actually spoken at all, an opportunity to speak. So I'll pass over to Assemblyman Berry. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to check, this section is intended as essentially a wrap-up section to deal with any other issues there might be to do with the ability to access the planning system, to be able to access information that you're even able to access the planning system, if that makes sense. I wanted to make sure that everybody in the room was able to contribute in terms of inequalities of access. Now, I think Patricia made a really, really good point there about inequality of resources. I think that also applies to the Assembly versus the Mayor in a lot of senses as well. And that obviously affects all different protected groups. But first of all, I just wanted to ask if anyone has any other points to make in terms of accessibility, regards to any other kind of disproportion that there might be, and levels of access that aren't simply related to socioeconomic status. And I have Heloise, which is very useful.
Hi,
Thank you, because you have not spoken very much.
I haven't spoken very much. Do you want me to introduce myself more fully?
Please do, yes.
Okay, I'm the administrator for the Spitalfields Trust, which is a building preservation trust and campaigning heritage group, which has been based in Spitalfields for the past, since the 1970s, but I'm not that old. So actually, it was more really to do with the sort of scrutiny element of what's been brought up a couple of times, and in terms of the disparity, what has shocked me, and this may not be true now because I haven't checked in the past few months, but the GLA doesn't have its own conservation officer, and nearly all local authorities will have a kind of heritage expert of some sort. So that really surprised me in terms of a lot of the decisions that you're making and the assessments that you're making. You need to have that sort of expertise as well, and that has really come out in a lot of the reports, that just the sort of knowledge or awareness doesn't seem to be there in terms of a lot of the planning matters and legislation, that sort of thing. The three major applications that we've dealt with have been called in by the Mayor and approved within Spitalfields in the past sort of 7 or 8 years, have all had huge heritage elements to them, and that has been really kind of stark, I think. That expertise needs to be within that team. But, yeah.
That is really interesting, actually. I mean, I know that quite often heritage, because heritage has a statutory status, the preservation of the buildings and the heritage often is used as a proxy for preservation of many other things.
Yeah.
And if you might have a comment on that, because I believe that there's also aspects of the Truman Brewery we're trying to use heritage as a proxy for what is a much wider community conservation of community benefits, if that makes sense.
I mean, absolutely. I think the big thing here is that heritage isn't just reduced to buildings, and I think when you look at why people come to Spitalfields, you'll see the reason it's the most successful place in East London for tourists even is that they want to come and see that layering that London is so, known for internationally. And I think that ties in with the local culture and what's emerging through there. For example, the British Bangladeshi culture is a very emergent new culture that has come from there, and it's the only place in the Western world that is able to do that. Now, why is that not given that same right or a distinct right? I don't know. And why is it that it's constantly under threat? We need to kind of look at that. The other thing is, where is that conversation happening in terms of culture? Where in the planning process does it come in? Presently, the cultural risk is the only one that we've engaged with.
Can you expand on that, just for the sake of the transcript?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier the culture at risk group. What is that, and does it have a role in planning?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not quite sure where it is. I mean, it's a bunch of officers who come round and try to explain to you what that retrospectively try to fix culture, like as if the developers cared about culture in the first place, or the landowners cared about the culture in the first place. The other thing massively in London in terms of policy is actually class. Now, I know we don't want to address it because everybody thinks that we're all equal in some ways, but we're not, And the communities I'm part of are very much facing that at various levels. Now, that has an impact on why gentrification happens as social cleansing, why certain people don't walk down certain streets, certain people have been pushed out, why there's gated communities. And as a result, opportunities don't reach people that it's said to reach. And I think that's why people don't engage with the planning system, because they realise they could be at a loss with the development that might be coming up locally.
Very much, yeah. I think I mentioned before the Housing Committee recommendation. That was part of an investigation into whether people's voices are heard in relation to social housing. Now, I want to go back to heritage, though, because I realise now that we haven't heard from Connor yet, and you are from the Victorian Society. I just want to know, this idea that there's no specialist conservation or heritage officers within the GLA seems a bit wrong. Can you comment on that, and also anything else you want to add, because you haven't spoken yet?
Yes, sorry, I haven't spoken yet, but I do have a few points. Hopefully I can address them. I'm very new in my role, so I haven't actually had any personal experience of a case or hearing, but I'm glad to sort of learn a lot from the various people who've spoken. The one that was recently, I think, was the Hondo Tower case in Brixton, where we had some concerns. I think, as Eloise pointed out, the fact that there isn't a specialist conservation officer is very worrying, certainly from the Victorian Society's point of view, and I imagine the other national amenity societies. The point that also worried us, I think, is that in terms of how it works on paper, that the mayor won't see the representations that have been made to the local authority until the stage 2 referral. I understand perhaps that sometimes because cases have come before, maybe he will have seen them. But to think that he'll have had 6 weeks to think about how it goes with the London plan to make comments, but without a conservation professional having made any comments perhaps, or being available, and then only for the national amenity societies or other heritage groups is comments to come in at the very end, I think that's very worrying for us. And I think a recommendation we would like to see would be perhaps it made more clear that certainly comments from certain groups, and probably heritage groups, would be available to the mayor more early on in how the case runs. I know the case with the Hondo Tower, I think, was that actually the objection that we made, the mayor didn't actually see it until we had to remind him of that. And sort of talking on the point of communication, I haven't certainly heard anything about the Hondo Tower case. I've been looking through my predecessor's emails and I haven't seen anything, I think, since he sent those in 2020. So, I'd probably like to speak to Heba a bit about it after.
Same for us.
I'll come to you next. Is that all right if I come after?
I think the only other issue was the criteria. And I think not having personal experience, when speaking with this through with the director of the society, we're always hopeful and confident that a process which allows more scrutiny for contentious cases should be something to look forward to as a good thing. I think from what some of the other people here today, especially Michael Bach, saying about how many cases are approved and how often it seems that the referral system is only to approve cases which are refused. I'm not quite so sure we'd want more heritage cases referred perhaps now. I mean, some of the ideas we did have was the London plan is very clear on the complete loss of significance of designated assets, and so one idea might be that the complete demolition of listed buildings would automatically be referred, but I don't know if that was something we might want to happen now. And also perhaps the height of buildings in conservation areas. There's a lot of detail in the criteria about heights of buildings in different areas, but I didn't actually notice any specific heritage criteria within that document. And I think yes, and as a conservation group with professional expertise, I think just as we would want more engagement with community groups earlier on in these cases, because they have so many things to bring about how these developments will work in an area, I would hope that conservation groups could also be involved earlier, especially with statutory ones, such as ourselves, who could also bring that conservation expertise earlier on in the process and help and inform it.
Thank you. Right, so I'm going to come to Heba now, because it would be very interesting to know what happened there with the Hondo Tower. But also then I noticed, Jonathan, you've got your hand up, so I'll come to you after that as well.
Yeah, so in terms of like us kind of making our voices heard as part of the process, I mean, I don't know how to kind of explain it without sounding like utterly like aghast, because it has kind of been, like I said, a race against time. Like we go out and we do community outreach as part of our campaign. So like on Saturdays and Sundays, we kind of go out and we bring banners and we bring postcards that we ask people to fill in. And this is a way for our communities to fill in their objections. We go out with people who speak different languages. So I speak Arabic. I go out and kind of talk to people, often of Moroccan descent, who don't even speak my dialect. We have to kind of communicate somehow. We have people who speak Spanish who come and kind of give information to the Latinx community that reside in Brixton and around there. And we get the information out. And at the minute we discuss this plan with them and we show them what is going to happen and what's going to take place in Brixton, they are aghast and they want to put in their application, and they feel betrayed because they haven't been told about it. And when they ask us, like, when will this hearing take place and like how can we participate in it, we are often like we can't really provide them an answer because we are working within a state of like uncertainty at all time. Like I still to this date don't know when our hearing is going to be taking place. We have been organizing on it since March when we were called to stage 3. And yeah, like it's all very like everyone in our group is basically at the risk of burnout because we're putting a lot of resource, a lot of personal time and energy into it, but we are working within like I guess like an environment that is just constantly shifting and we're not told about it kind of taking place. And also like in terms of objections, like we gathered maybe 10,000 objections in total from postcards, from objections like made to the council website, also to the GLA website and through petitions. And when we had our like council meeting, they were completely just thrown out. And that's the reason why I think Sadiq Khan decided to take it to basically a stage 3 referral, because like we were entitled to be heard from like in that forum, but like that was just completely taken away and then like forgotten about for a while. And yeah, like through allies like the Victorian Society, we've been able to kind of push back. But yeah, it's just been a very, very difficult process. And yeah, we've been hoping to kind of like convey information to the community, but when we're not given the information, it's just extremely difficult state to be put in, this like uncertainty. So yeah, I'll kind of leave it there.
Excellent. Right, I have lots of hands up, and I'm not quite sure how much time we have, Chair. I'd quite like to make a final list of speakers. So anyone who still wants to speak, please raise your hands. Yeah, I've got you down already, Jonathan. Jerry, I have you on the list. Natalia, I do not.
Nice and concise.
And Richard, that was you again, wasn't it? Okay, brilliant. That is the final list. I'm really sorry. So, I said I'd come to Jonathan next. Is that all right? I know, Emma, you have a question, but are we getting very far away from the topic that you wanted to ask the question about?
If I can come in briefly, but you go through your
list.
list.
You're going to ask a question to the panel?
Yes.
Okay. We know what happened last time.
Hopefully it'll be more succinct.
Okay, excellent. Can you put that in now, and then we can maybe ask the people who've lined up to speak to respond to that question as well as what they wanted to say.
Yeah. I just wanted to basically talk about the fact that I think the call-in process has really evolved under this last mayor's mayoralty, and to raise that he's calling in applications at double the rate that they used to be, and actually the process now, they are being amended after where they weren't before. And from what we've heard today, it feels like that process is really weighted against residents, and we've heard some really good ideas about petitioning, reducing or amending criteria, and a bigger GLA scrutiny field. So I wanted to, in those last answers, to just hear some more about how people thought we can re-weight the GLA kind of planning call-in so it feels like it works for residents as well. Does that make sense?
Yes, that is really useful. Yes, that's really helpful. That's quite a general point. So yeah, anyone else who wants to contribute to that. Also, Claire, I realise I didn't bring you yet in this section, even though I'm trying to do it quickly. If there's anything you'd like to add, would you let us know?
Yeah, thanks for that.
I don't mean right now. I mean, can you just put your hand up and I'll put you on the list?
Okay.
Sorry.
It's really quick, though.
I've been making Jonathan wait a very long time.
Okay, well, then by all means, go, Jonathan. But
okay,
but
I'll bring you in.
It's a positive, constructive suggestion.
Yeah.
So,
great, thank you. Jonathan, sorry for making you wait so long.
Yeah, I just want to loop back to the issues of, first of all, culture at risk. So we've had conversations with culture at risk in the context of actually both the Bishopsgate Goods Yard and also Truman Brewery, which was kind of interesting. And I'm not that familiar with what culture at risk really does, but the conversation was curious because in the case of the Truman Brewery, they were quite interested in, well, they took an interest, and in fact they did actually submit a representation and an objection of sorts to Tower Hamlets Council. But when it came to the goods yard, they didn't want to get involved, and the reason they gave was that it had been called in. And they seemed to think that there was a potential conflict of interest between culture at risk having an opinion on an application that had been called in. So they were very reluctant to get involved at all, which doesn't feel quite right to me. But then the broader issue about heritage, lack of heritage interest, it seems to me, at the London level. Now, in Tower Hamlets, we've got a quite acute problem here because there's a complete lack of interest at the council level as well. Tower Hamlets Council, unlike many councils, doesn't have a heritage champion. It doesn't run conservation area advisory committees, which neighbouring Hackney Council does do. Its conservation officers are very weak and tend to be reactive rather than proactive. Again, I could contrast with Hackney, where they're very much take the lead on planning issues quite often. So in the face of a complete lack of interest amongst anyone in the council in Tower Hamlets, we have there's no one to appeal to at the London level. And given that culture and heritage, and when I say heritage, it's not just about the bricks and mortar, it's very much about community heritage as well. Given that's such an important, vital aspect of what London's all about, it's astonishing that we've got this complete vacuum, especially in East London, which is a really important historical part of the capital. This is tourist industry, if nothing else. I'm amazed that there's a vacuum here. Then I just wanted to add just something about the. Actually, I won't go into it. I was going to say something about High Street's funding, which seems to be connected with the Heritage Lottery Fund, and some of this funding, or Historic England, or heritage funding seems to come through either the Heritage Lottery Fund or Historic England. So there's this weird situation where Historic England is getting involved in funding things like community events for High Street regeneration, which doesn't seem to be really what they're about. And then in this particular case, which I think Saif might have mentioned earlier, there have been High Street funds handed out up and down the country, about 100 of them for High Street regeneration. In Tower Hamlets, 2 organisations received that funding. One was the Business Improvement District of Aldgate, and the other was on Redchurch. Both of these are community organisations heavily backed by developers. And it seems to me that you have to have a developer to back you before you attract any government money to save you, which feels quite improper.
Thank you very much. I won't elaborate, but I think it's very interesting, this concept of different parts of the GLA that fund things, not wanting to get involved in planning. And I think we probably need to not talk about that more, but I think we maybe could in the future as a committee. Jerry, from the 35% campaign, you've been waiting patiently as well.
Yes, 2 areas which we haven't considered where the Mayor might engage more with the local community. Monitoring the delivery of affordable housing and the consideration of viability assessments. We've become increasingly concerned in Southwark after several instances have come to light of affordable housing that's been agreed not actually being delivered, or being delivered not as the tenure it should be. And the local government ombudsman did find that our borough, Southwark, didn't actually have a proper monitoring system in place. That finding was back in 2016. Now, some effort has been made to remedy this in Southwark, but we still don't have a proper monitoring system in the borough, and we do wonder whether this situation might be being repeated in other boroughs, and what does this actually mean for the reporting of statistics and so forth to the Mayor from those boroughs. So we think he should turn his attention to that.
Sorry, Jerry, this is the post-approval monitoring of compliance with Section 106 agreements. Is there any difference between things that have been called in by the Mayor and things that have just been approved by the local authority? I know that Southwark's had a number of very large developments that have obviously been under mayoral.
Yeah, I don't think any instance has come to light where an application which the Mayor has called in has not delivered any affordable housing, or not delivered the proper affordable housing. But I think the problem is we don't really know, unless there's a proper monitoring system in place. We're in the dark. And the instances that have come to light have been through concerned local citizens who have noticed something isn't quite right, got in touch with the local authority or got in touch with other people, and that's the way it's been flushed out. And it's the absence of a proper system which is allowing this to happen. And I think it's something the Mayor needs to have a look at. The other area is viability assessment. Now, the Mayor did promise before taking office that there would be more transparent and stringent scrutiny of viability assessments and their use by developers to reduce their S106 contributions, particularly in the shape of affordable housing. Now, nonetheless, after several years in office, not enough of the housing that's being built is affordable, and certainly not enough is social rented. So, what's happening? Why hasn't this scrutiny of viability assessments given us more affordable housing? And we think the Mayor should ensure that at the least no referred application should deliver anything less than the affordable housing required by the local plan or the new London plan, whichever is the greater. And simply that developers are not allowed to frustrate this, as they are undoubtedly being allowed to do so far. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I know that yes, thank you, Chair. I know that Natalia's been waiting for a long time. I've noticed Eloise, and I have got you on the list. Thank you. You can put your hand down. Sakina, though, would like to make a tiny point. So I'm just going to interrupt, and then I'll come to you straight afterwards. And yeah, so thank you for your patience.
Assembly Member, I thought I was coming a little late. I just wanted to make a sort of point to balance out the point we had around the evolution of the call-in under this Mayor versus the last Mayor, and I think it speaks to the last point that you were making, Jerry, so I just wanted to bounce off that in terms of this last section about broader context of planning, which I think, yes, we have seen an evolution of the call-in process under this Mayor. I think there's been a much deeper and bigger concentration on providing affordable housing, and I think that's been quite a monumental shift from the last Mayor. I personally think it's inappropriate to have said that the evolution of this call-in process under this Mayor is pitted against communities when the precise opposite is evidenced in terms of aspirational plans and community engagement documentation. And I think that this section or this session is about us saying, is it working? And if you're saying, no, it's not working, we're saying, great, we're here to make sure it does work, so let's continue.
Assembly Member Sheikh, thank you. And that's a bit of a summing up point, and we are within 5 minutes of the end.
I was just going to say, just continue in that constructive manner. So
I appreciate the sentiment completely.
There is a question. So regards to making sure there's more affordable and social rented housing, I couldn't agree more. And I think that actually the wider context is planning reforms are incoming nationally. And I think we should be saying really clearly with our chest and pushing them, and the Mayor, I'll say this openly, to drastically reform viability assessment so that it is not weighted in the way of developers being prioritised on their level of profit over the amount of affordable housing that's provided. And I just wanted to put that back to the groups as something that is incoming in the wider planning context. And I think we need to have our finger on the pulse with that.
We've got so little time left.
I'll pass back over. Thank you for indulging me, Chair.
Keep all the contributions. We've literally got 5 minutes left, so Assembly Member.
Contribute. And I don't, meetings are not massively for Assembly Members to express our opinions. Natalia, I'm sorry for making you wait there.
Problem. Thank you very much. I just want to make a point in relation to Jerry's last point about monitoring and accountability of concessions made on approval. Now, we work with Black, Asian, minority, ethnic traders in the Elephant and Castle area, and this application was approved back in 2018 by the Mayor. Now, nearly 2 years have passed, more than 2 years have passed, and right now we have got traders working in limbo, traders that had been promised an alternative relocation space, traders that were part of the community, of the DNA of the community for over 25, nearly 30 years. That have generated local jobs, that have invested in the local economy, that have served the community, that have celebrated multicultural and diverse London. Right now, we've got traders that are waiting because negotiations with the developer haven't been successful. So how are we scrutinizing and monitoring that process? We are concerned at the moment because some of these traders, despite being in the community for many years and serving the local community and Londoners for many years, are made to wait because of very hard, difficult negotiations that developers are putting in place, which are making it impossible for them to relocate, even though that offer was made there. To the point that we think, are they still going to be around within 5 years? So that promise of an affordable retail space, once the development is completed, will still materialize? Because right now negotiations are so difficult that I think they're making it impossible for those traders to relocate. And not only that, these are traders that have got an offer and a promise of relocation. We also have got traders that have been waiting for a place to relocate, market traders that are desperate. And it's just listening to the human side and the desperation that these people bring to us as community grassroots organizations.
I've been to visit the traders you talk about, and you're completely right.
So we need to monitor this process, please.
Right, I'm just asking for final wrap-up points from, if you can be as quick as you possibly can, Richard, and then Eloise, and then Claire, if you can take the last contribution, that would be great.
Richard Lee, Just Space. Three quick proposals. Firstly, that the mayor should be required to apply the public sector equality duty when considering both stage 2 and the stage 3. Stage 2 is equally important because it's the route to the stage 3. And that shouldn't be done in an abstract way, but the equality impact assessment must ensure that it's grounded in the needs of the different equality groups, and that would bring in the resourcing issue which Patria raised, which Just Space 100% supports. Secondly, the officers' reports to the mayor on stage 2 and also on stage 3 must be made much more in the public arena. A simple, easy way to do this would be to ensure that those reports automatically go to the assembly members for you to help circulate, should automatically go to the objectors to the planning permission. That should be quite easy and automatic, and should automatically be placed on the borough's website, because some people find that easier to navigate than the GLA website. So we feel that would be a very useful addition, and then really the final point is really a request for your review to itself ensure that all the aspirations of Smart City, London Development Database and so on, that you help us all by actually within your report making transparent what's been happening in terms of stage 2 and stage 3 call-ins. And really the point I missed was that the reports on stage 2 and stage 3 just have to detail where the mayor has met with officers at the borough, has met with developer, changes as a result of the mayor's intervention. Let's put all those in a transparent report so that we don't have to be using freedom of information.
I think that's right, and that was a recommendation in a letter from this committee to the mayor in 2019, that transparency, and also the public sector equality duties in the housing committee, so I'm sure we can pick those up. Eloise?
Yeah, on housing, Norton Folgate was decided by Boris Johnson, partly because it had a decent proportion of housing with a largely commercial scheme. Subsequently, the developers applied to have all of it as commercial, which was then approved by the local authority. And it's concerning also that this is going to be mirrored at the Old Truman Brewery, which is again a largely commercial and retail development. It's a fraction of an enormous site which will eventually be entirely developed. The owner says he doesn't do housing, and the Tower Hamlets needs housing.
Thank you very much. And Claire, so apologies for making you wait so long. You were supposed to go first in this section, but I'm sure you can summarise.
But I will summarise by saying that we started this whole discussion with Michael Bach's point that the current call-in process is a route to approval, or at least that's the perception, if you go back to the question about perceptions. And I would just like to say in closing that you guys have a fantastic opportunity to change that the actual call-in process can be a genuine opportunity for community groups and others to feel that they're getting a better process. I mean, there's 32 boroughs here, so everyone is going to have approved or refused or whatever the decision at the local level was. And the mayor has an opportunity to really create that delta effect, that this is going to be different. And there's two ways, I just want to summarize that. I think that the transparency issue that Richard talked about is actually paramount. But just to throw a word in for the record that we haven't talked about, again, an opportunity. We haven't really talked about digital, and we haven't talked about. I think, Sakina, you said that or Heba said that when they went around with those cards, that residents, when they visually engaged with what was happening to their community, they react. I have personally found that in Mortlake, and there is fantastic visualization software out there, ways to show residents what is happening, not just on buildings, not just on trees, but socioeconomic effects, cultural effects. This can all be presented in a much more user-friendly, very inspiring way. And I would like to put forward that that's something that's considered, and that to make that delta effect, final point, that you need a splash. You need something really soon, to show that we're really thinking creatively and innovatively about this process, and that this is an opportunity. And I really hope to see that.
Thank you very, very much. I'll hand you back to the chair.
I do notice that Michael Bach had his hand up quite consistently. Can you do this in 30 seconds?
It's easy. I am not deprived. I am bullish and go out and get things rather than wait for them to come to me. I think all those improvements to the process are necessary, but they're not sufficient. You get site visits. We took the officers round. We got enough time. We required 30 minutes, not 15. We were able to show visuals. But what's the good if nobody's listening, watching? And most of the reports of what residents said is just a tick box, so they haven't forgotten anybody, not to deal with the substance of what they were saying. And yes, it was advertised, notified to all objectors. A lot of those things were done. But that doesn't deal with the fact that the report was heavily skewed and was not a proper assessment against policy for some of the issues, and it was no good telling them on the day because nobody was listening. So
very good point.
You need to improve the process, but actually it is, the flaw is in the whole calling thing.
Thank you very much. Good point on which to finish. I'd just like to thank all your guests for all your contributions. I'm sorry if you felt you didn't get your 5 minutes worth. I'm sorry about that. I have to be a brutal chair sometimes in order to get all the voices heard. Can we, committee, note the report and today's discussions? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the party group leads to agree any output from the discussion?
Notation agreed.
Thank you very much. Those guests are free to go. The rest is like going to take 2 minutes, but like in that time you could get to the front door. So the item 6 is Planning and Regeneration Committee Work Programme. Can we note the committee's work committee programme? Work programme. Date of next meeting. The next meeting of this committee is scheduled for Thursday the 6th of January at 2 p.m. Is there any other business the chair considers urgent? I've got no other urgent business apart from gasping for a cup of tea. Thank you very much. That's meeting closed.
Thank you.